Today we wanted to talk to you about the historical Jesus. And I thought we would start out by basically dividing it up into three sections. And the first section I want to do is establish that the Jesus that we know and the historical Jesus existed. And the reason I wanted to start here is because, the internet atheists have run amok with this Jesus mythicism. And there are so many people that are being impacted on a lay level that it's mind blowing. And I thought that, yeah, we got to at least establish this. I just recently watched a video from one of our atheist counterparts who is called the Godless Engineer. And he's probably one of Pallmann's favorite guys, but no, I'm just kidding. But no, he he actually responded to you, and I was like, oh, you can't harp on Dr. Habermas without
Huh.
me saying something. So we're probably gonna do a response video in the near future with that one. But yeah, so
What's he going after?
oh
What I mean, what topic?
oh, he's kind of vulgar, so he just said you're full of you're full of it. That's what he said when he started looking
Yeah,
at your arguments. But that's some of these guys, they just don't have anything of substance. So they kind of try to mix their own little humor and stuff into it. Little do they know they're doing bad historical research and so forth. So yeah. So that's kind of like
yeah.
where I wanted to start, and I'm gonna hand it over to David real quick. He had the first question about this, and I will let him go for it.
Well, yeah, and again, it's really great to have you on the show. So I'm happy to have you here. But when I was like in freshman year in college, there was like Richard Carrier was the big deal, and I'm sure you've heard of him. But all the atheists, like especially the mythicists, would point to him as their big PhD scholar historian who had definitively proved that Jesus never existed, right? So, kind of, what are your basic thoughts on Carrier's work? What do you think? Are his arguments really any good? Is he someone we need to take seriously? How do other scholars view him? What are your thoughts on Richard Carrier?
Well, I often let atheist and agnostic specialists do the talking for me. And as you know, many of the internet skeptics don't trust the specialists who are atheists and agnostics because they blow the radical ones that are not scholars. They blow them away. And Bart Ehrman has a long section on the mythicists in his book Did Jesus Exist? And he says some of them, what they present are he calls them laughers. He calls them and he calls them worse names. I mean, not vulgar things, but he makes comments about them like they don't have a clue what's going on in the scholarly world. However, he does say that of all the thousands of religion, New Testament, classical, historical type professors that he knows who teaches religion, he said thousands. He said there's only two, basically, that have terminal degrees and are well respected. Those are Richard Carrier and Bob Price. And he says none of them, including those two, hold teaching positions in accredited university seminaries or colleges. Now, that book of Ehrman's that I'm citing came out a few years ago, so it's something could happen. I mean, it could have changed. Someone's going to get a place somewhere. But at the time of his writing, there weren't any to speak of. And so Bart Ehrman goes off on him. He just says they're not respected. He makes some derogatory comments. He basically says having one of these guys, not Carrier or Price, but he says having one of the real radical ones on your faculty would be like having a radical fundamentalist Christian, and the Christians aren't going to make it on our faculty, and neither are these guys. Kind of, I stretched that out a little bit, but that basically was where he was going.
All right.
Well, yeah. So you're saying we don't even have to appeal to evangelical scholars to show that these guys are not that they're not even really well respected by even atheist scholars on the matter, right? And if I'm not mistaken, Price doesn't even have a degree in historical studies. At least I heard his degree was in theology.
Well, he's got two PhDs. One is in New Testament, and
Okay.
one is in theology. And they're from a good school, Drew University in Philadelphia, I believe. And actually, this is crazy. I'm friends with a lot of these guys, and I've been a friend of Bob's for over 25 years. And we write back and forth very respectfully. We don't talk a lot, but when we do, it's just like, I talked to you last week and I'm fitting right in with you again. It's like two old hippies talking. So, I mean, Bob's a real nice guy. He's got two PhDs. And even Ehrman said that he and Carrier's field is classics / ancient history. And Price and Carrier are both given kudos by Ehrman for being well trained. You fellas probably know Price and Ehrman debated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw that.
And
yeah,
I don't know I don't know. I don't listen to debates anymore, but don't know how it went.
Okay.
Oh, Ehrman won.
Ehrman.
I've heard that, but you don't often want to quote rumors and think that's absolutely what happened. But
right.
was it pretty clear?
In my opinion, yeah, I thought
it was too. I give Bob kudos for the way he presents and his the way he presents himself. So that's always a good in a debate. So, but
yeah, he's a good guy. He's a friend. I wish he were my next door neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wish we could get together for an occasional cup of coffee once a month. I mean, I would enjoy it. He invited me down to his home a few years ago. And I would just love to sit down with him and chat. I mean, that would be fine.
Yep. So Dr. Habermas, I do want to get into some of the claims that Carrier makes. I think it goes well into establishing whether the historical Jesus existed. Carrier makes an argument about the ascension of Isaiah, and that it is what influenced Paul, and that Paul didn't believe in the risen Jesus, but that Jesus was crucified in the heavenly realm. Why should we reject that as Christians and as believers and historians?
How about just a one-liner? Because there is either I'll put the two comments together. No adequate historical data. And there's too much supposition in those comments. You cannot connect the two. Listen, in philosophy, there's an argument. It's a methodological move, and it's often referred to as coherence. And two things can cohere, very much so, and neither can be true. Or they can cohere, and one could be true and one could be false, etc. But coherence doesn't prove something. And so just because something is similar or it seems like somebody is referring to that source, that's so far from proving it. It's not even methodologically, it's not a good place to go. Secondly, I would say my other point would be that the historical data for Jesus as a person is so strong. I mean, again, Bart Ehrman says it well. He says none of the thousands of specialists in appropriate areas, none of them, as far as he knows, thousands, believe that Jesus never existed. He said it's not even counted as a reputable view. Now, he accepts Ehrman and Price. So you probably say, well, they've got good credentials. They can say what they want to. But I think he would keep saying, at least in the book, Did Jesus Exist? He would say, the specialists, they're not convincing any of the specialists. They might convince the people who are listening to their blogs who themselves, well, the two of them are trained. The people listening to their blogs, by and large, may not be trained, and they kind of lap the stuff up, but it's not impressing the scholars. That's what Ehrman says.
All right. Yeah, these guys, in several debates, these guys go after our sources, such as our patristic fathers and the enemy attestation. The one I heard recently was that Josephus wasn't talking about James, the brother of Jesus of Nazareth, right? So he was talking about somebody else. Do you have any good counter arguments for things like that, or is it along the same
Yeah,
lines?
how about Josephus scholars utterly reject
Yeah,
that? I mean, you know, I do want to make a pause
yeah,
here. We, I I don't want to be guilty of rejecting arguments because quote unquote nobody agrees with you, or because quote unquote the specialists don't agree. The specialists can be wrong, and truth is not settled by how many people agree with you. But the implication is Bart Ehrman, if everybody in the field, all the specialists, do not take that view, that doesn't prove it wrong, but it might indicate that there are reasons against that position. And it's the reasons, just like my minimal facts argument on the resurrection. People think I argue from the weight of scholarly evidence. No, that's the second and much lesser point, because that's just a methodological, don't argue with me, your own books say this. By far, the most important point is the reason you ought not argue with me is because you're wrong on the data. The data determine whether this is true or false, not what Bart Ehrman says. I just want to be
oh
clear
yeah,
about that. Not what Bart Ehrman says, not what the reputation is, not the fact that no scholars in credit positions are going to agree with them. It's the evidence behind it. And I don't think that the mythicists have an evidential leg to stand on.
yeah. Okay, so would that be the same then? Like, how do we know Eusebius got Papias right? Stuff like that. How do we know that for sure, or not even for sure, but at least to a varying degree of probability? I guess what I'm trying to say is, how do we evidentially establish who are you know that Jesus existed? What is the best method, and how do we come to that data?
Well, this might surprise people, but I've got a skeptical streak in me, and anybody who knows my testimony knows I've been there, done that for 10 straight years and another 10 after that. And it's all over the place that I considered Buddhism and thought at one point that I was very, very close to accepting Buddhism. But, but people often say, yeah, well, he was probably a kid when he did that. He's probably 15. No, that was post PhD. Post PhD. So I've grappled with a lot of these things, and I have a skeptical streak. And having said that, David, I would say I don't trust what Eusebius says. Um, could Eusebius be true? Yeah, he could be. But he writes 300 years after Jesus. You know, that's not the end of the world in the ancient historical world. I mean, you could be right, but that is not a good distance. Now the comment is, well, he's citing Papias, and Papias could be writing as early as 110 AD. Most people put him at about 125, and that's only 25 years after the New Testament canon. That's a better argument. The thing is, though, who gives us Papias? And of course, what we have in Papias, a bunch of fragments. So Papias is a great source, but we don't know much of what he said. If there's a book in the ancient world that we wished we had that's missing, it's probably Exposition of the Oracles of the Lord by Papias. But we have fragments. So since he's citing Papias, that's probably okay. But just when Eusebius is talking at plus 300 after Jesus, I don't think that's a good argument. I, I um, I will list Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp at uh, 95, 17, and 110 AD. But that's right there at the end of the New Testament. I think they're a lot better sources for sure, but we don't get the Papias stuff in them. So sorry for that
No,
little
no,
run on.
that's
But
perfect.
I would not base if listen, if Eusebius were my major source of the resurrection, I would be in despair.
All right. Well, I'm going to take us out of the weeds here because I think we addressed this mythicist issue, and uh, established that, we have very good evidence that Jesus existed. And now we can actually get to the good stuff. And I know you're going to love some of this stuff because I've heard you talk about it several times. But how do we evidentially establish who Jesus was? What's, who he said he was? What is the best method to that approach, even?
Well, again, I would use a Bart Ehrman or a Garrett Ludeman, atheist specialist. They don't have a Christian axe to grind. Garrett Ludeman says the resurrection of Jesus and the fact that there were real experiences afterward, those two things are indisputable. In fact, this is often not known, Garrett Ludeman says that the evidence indicates, and that's more important than Garrett Ludeman or Gary Habermas say so. It's that the evidence indicates this view for Ludeman, and he says the experiences of the disciples were reported immediately after they happened. Immediately. Bart Ehrman says that the early Christian creeds, like 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following, many of them are resurrection creeds, many of them. Ehrman says they could all have existed before Paul was converted. That means before +2 or 3 after the cross. That's when Paul's conversion is dated, +2 or +3. Some dare to say as early as 18 months, but +2 or 3 is normal for either believers or skeptics. And he says the creeds, possibly or probably, this is Ehrman, all came from Jerusalem. All were pre-Pauline conversion, and Paul could have known about them ahead of time. That is early, and that beats any of the sources we're talking about from Clement and about 95 up to Eusebius. So I like to talk about those early sources and how we know those creedal sources are accurate. What makes Ehrman, there's a question, what makes Ehrman and Ludeman and many others, like Jewish New Testament scholars, Gezer Vermesh, Pinchas Lapid, what makes, they're both passed away, but what makes people like that say this stuff is absolutely credible historically? In fact, Pinchas Lapid said the material in 1 Corinthians 15 is so reliable you can treat it as a testimony of eyewitnesses. So, I mean, that's pretty heavy from 2 Jewish New Testament scholars and 2 other atheist New Testament scholars.
All right, well, I'm going to hand it over to David again. He had another question that was coming up, and then we'll get back to the early sources too.
Sure.
Yeah. I think an important point with establishing Jesus's existence, establishing who he was, and even to an important degree, interpreting the evidence for the resurrection, comes down to this question of: did Jesus view himself as deity? Did he view himself as God? Do we have good evidence to think that this was the sort of way that he viewed himself, right? Because if we just have like a resurrection of a random person, then that's a little strange. It's difficult to know how to interpret that. But if you have this person claiming to be divine, then that immediately gives us, I think, an additional reason to really consider the possibility of a resurrection. So do you think we have good evidence for thinking that Jesus claimed to be God?
Okay, virtually everybody that I know of, evangelicals included, do not think that Jesus said at any one point, I am God. And maybe one of the reasons for that is the confusion that may have been caused by him saying, I am God, and they're saying, but God's up there, and you're down here, and then you have to immediately opt into the Trinity. In other words, and the Trinity was a much later idea. That didn't make it untrue, but what we call the formulation of the Trinity came later. In the New Testament, let me be clear, there are 3 people in the 3 persons in the New Testament. They're traditionally called Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They are all called deity in the New Testament. But to say it the way I would say it, Jesus claimed to be deity, yes. And he did that largely by his claims and his actions. And the claims he did make according to critical rules of attestation. He did make claims to be divine and a very high view of divine. This is not known so much about many of these critics, but a guy like Bart Ehrman, who thinks Jesus was adopted as a son of God, God took this man and exalted him. But what we don't realize is the way that the critics who take that view, there's been a great book written against it edited by Michael Bird and a bunch of others from Zondervan that came out the same time as Ehrman's book on the subject. But what we don't realize is that the critics who say that, even though that view is rejected, that Jesus was adopted, even though it's rejected by conservatives, the view presents a Christology that would wow a lot of people. Ehrman thinks, and a lot of other people think, that story in the early church, that narrative, included the pre-existence of Jesus, a la Philippians chapter 2, which Philippians 2 has that phrase. It says Jesus was in the morphe of God. And the next verse, he's in the morphe of a servant. Now, whenever we do that, there are different views on exactly how the incarnation works. But the chief meaning of morphe, in English, morphe means form. And form can be something hollow, kind of an outline, kind of a roughed-in house that hasn't been filled in with drywall and a roof. But in Greek, the primary meaning of morphe has to do with nature. And in that early creed in Philippians chapter 2, it says Jesus was in the morphe of God. Now, Jesus didn't say that, but there's an early creed that affirms that. So the early creeds do affirm those things. My favorite example, Romans 10:9, if we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in our heart that God's raised him from the dead, we'll be saved. Many New Testament scholars think that Lord is the loftiest term that is used in the New Testament. Jesus is called God, is literally called God, about a half dozen times, depending on the Greek syntax, in various New Testament epistles. He's called God. But they think that even that title, God, as it's cited in the creeds and whatnot, is not as lofty as being called Lord, primarily because Lord, Adonai, is the equivalent of the Hebrew word for Jehovah. So it's a loftier term, and Jesus is called Lord, Son of God, Son of Man. We ought never forget, Son of Man should not be treated lightly. Some people think Son of Man is as heavy as the other two concepts. And Jesus did claim to be Son of Man, Son of God, so on.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've always kind of odd that kind of these evolutionary ideas that like the deity of Christ was something that grew up over time. Like that's how it happened. It always seems to me that like as we trace church history, we start out with the high Christology and it's the lower Christologies that come in later. But
That's
yeah, so I appreciate those insights.
Yeah.
Russell, I'm going to hand it back to you.
All right.
Yeah, look, guys, let me make a real quick comment about the last thing David just said. One of the words going around, one of the sentences going around right now that is heavy with meaning is cited by Richard Bauckham, but it's not original with him. And many New Testament scholars would say this is true, but here's the sentence. The earliest Christology is the highest Christology. That is incredible. That means that what comes out of the gates in approximately 30 AD, what comes out of the gates, Romans 10:9, if we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord, that's an early creed. Philippians 2, an early creed. Romans 1, 3, and 4, shown to be the Son of God, Lord, Messiah, by virtue of the resurrection. Early creed. Coming out of the gates, he was more in the morphe of God. Coming out of the gates, he's called Lord. Christians believe that from the very beginning. That's a very high Christology.
Very well. Yeah, it's so funny that you jumped right into what I was going to ask you. about the creeds. I was going to ask you why are they so strong? Why are they good good to incorporate into arguments and so forth? And how do we know they're early? And stuff like that. So
Yeah. Well, yeah. Do you want to spend
yeah, we could.
we want to spend a week on it? No, I mean, listen, guys, I teach a PhD course on the creeds, and we don't get off the subject and don't finish it during a
Wow.
PhD course. And they've got to write their research papers on the topic. It is loaded, loaded, loaded. Again, not because people say it is, but because the data say it is. And the comments I'm making, many of the most skeptical New Testament scholars will not disagree with what I just said. So how do we know? I think there's two major things that say your first question, David, as to why the creeds are so important. Comment number one, they are, critics call them pre-Pauline. Now, there's two senses. I don't want to get too involved, but there's two senses of pre-Pauline. One, the more conservative sense is pre-Pauline in the sense of they were circulating before Paul became a believer. They even predate Paul, so that you are not allowed to say, yeah, Paul made those things up. He's the one that invented the deity of Christ. Baloney. Read your books. Read the data. That's really early pre-Pauline. That makes it between 30 and 32, 30 and 33 AD. And if you take a 33 AD date for the crucifixion, it makes no difference. Then it's between 35 and 36, but the same gap of 2 to 3 years. The other kind of pre-Pauline means it simply has to predate Paul's epistles. And the first one is probably 1 Thessalonians, about 50 AD. So that's an old, I mean, that's like a not one of the earliest creeds if it only goes to 48 or 50 AD. You go, how do you know these things? Well, there's a place after which they can't be dated. And that is when they're mentioned in the earliest Pauline creeds, they're obviously earlier than the creeds in which they're written. So that tells you right there. But you know that there's got to be a reason when an Ehrman and a Ludemann and others say, yeah, these things were in the works and around and could be quoted before Paul was converted. It probably made him very angry, being an Orthodox Jew. That's one thing. High Christology from a very early date coming out of the gate. Secondly, you go, how do we know that? Best argument, it's only now being circulated. Most evangelicals, it does not even appear in their textbooks. If someone said to me, where is the best argument for these things? Is it the Gospel of John? I'd say no. I would use Mark 14, 61 to 64, Jesus before the high priest. But even that is not as strong an argument, in my opinion, as using here what Paul describes in Galatians 1 and 2. There are 7 of the books that bear Paul's name that critics will take at face value. That doesn't mean they're inerrant or inspired. That just means they're great sources. And one of those 7 is Galatians. Paul says he went up to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion. That's going to be +5 or +6 after the cross. He goes up to Jerusalem and spends 15 days with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. By the way, that objection earlier, David, on does Josephus mention James? I've got one source here by a major New Testament scholar says it's a unanimous view among scholars. That's not quite the case, but it's very close. Why are we going to cite Josephus when we can cite the fact that Paul is unquestionably taken to be authentic, and he spent that time in Jerusalem with James at plus 2 or 3, 2 or 3 years after 3 years after his conversion, +5 or 6 total. And he talked about the gospel in Galatians 1. How do you know? Well, that's the theme of the whole book of Galatians. But if you have a question, he goes back to Galatians. He goes back to Galatia in Galatians 2, first 10 verses, and he specifically says, I put before them the gospel I was preaching. And Paul says over and over again, Romans 1, Romans 10, the gospel he preached involved the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So when he's there with Peter and James in Jerusalem at +5 or 6, and then when he goes back the second time, still before the book of 1 Thessalonians, still pre-Pauline, John is now there. Why is that significant? because the big four are present. Paul, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John. And Paul says twice in those 10 verses in Galatians 2, they agreed with my message as the message I should take to the Gentiles. They agreed with my message. That combination of super, super early, super, super high proclamations, second point, confirmed by the big four at a very early date. You got that? You got it. That's the main argument. Early data confirmed by the big four, at a very early date.
Wow. Yeah, David, you got anything on that you say about that? I'm gonna turn it over because I've been kind of hogging it, David. So you've been hitting like one or two questions here and there, but you got the list of questions that we had. So I'm gonna let you take a little bit from me there.
All right. No, it's been awesome. But now we're gonna kind of turn, I think, this interview towards zero in on Dr. Habermas's area of expertise, and that's going to be the resurrection. So, Dr. Habermas, you've kind of become known for this minimal facts approach to the resurrection. So, if you could just kind of quickly lay that out for anyone who'll be watching and who maybe just isn't familiar with it, kind of what does that case look like, and what are these minimal facts?
Yeah, I like the way you say, can we do it quickly? I know you're not being derogatory, but in a funny way, it sounds like, yeah, can you do this quickly? I mean, like a little faster than you have been doing these things. I could go on and on and on. The minimal facts argument illustrates what we started at the beginning of the program. When David first asked me, what do we think about the mythicists? What do we think? I'll give the opinions of atheists and agnostic specialists. What do we think? But what it's based on are the data. The minimal facts argument starts with those 2 points. By far, the most important one is I will use no fact that is not multiply evidenced. Now, don't confuse multiple evidence with multiple textual attestation. Multiple attestation is one kind of what I mean by multiple evidence, because multiple evidence could be multiple attestation plus archaeology, for example. That would still be multiple arguments. And there are many multiple arguments for each fact I will use. Multiple arguments for each. In fact, I'm going to say something really bombastic. I often use what I call a 6+1 argument. Mike Lacone and I, in our book Case for the Resurrection, called it a 4+1. The numbers change all the time. You go, why do the numbers change? Because nobody only grants that few facts. So if there's a case where I need a couple more of them, I usually start out with 12 and then cut them down to 6. But one of the 12 that I don't use in the 6 is the empty tomb. It doesn't quite make my criteria for the minimal facts. But the evidence for the empty tomb, there are as many evidences for the empty tomb as there is for almost any other of the minimal facts. Then why don't you include it? Because the second point, which is lesser, that the second point is not quite as... The second point is because the facts are so good, almost all critical scholars agree with it. The agreement on the empty tomb is high, about 2/3 to 3/4, but it's not as unanimous as the other 6. And if I use those 6+1, only the evidence, not where the critics are, 6+1, there are over 100 separate morsels of data for saying those 6+1 are true. Over 100. You go, how do you get to over 100? That's a joke. Well, I mean things like, I'm being real picky. If I count every creed that is apropos, you could say, well, no, I think we should count the creedal arguments as one. That's fine. I'm okay with that. But if we broke everything down into their component parts, over 100 reasons to accept these 6+1. So I'll take the facts which are the most heavily evidenced, and therefore, except for the empty tomb, they're virtually unanimously accepted by critics. Though the empty tomb in there, and that's usually accepted by critics. So that's the way I use the argument. Multiply evidenced is by far the most important. Attested by almost everybody as a good starting point is a methodologically good point to begin.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that. And I'm getting echo over here, Russell.
Yeah,
But
it's okay.
all right. All right, so then we got some more specific questions here, just on some of the points for your case. Specifically, just how likely do you think it would be that Christianity could, just get off the ground in first century Palestine, right? What is the likelihood of that happening? And Russell, this is one of your questions, so I don't know if you wanted to add in there that, like, without the resurrection, how likely is it that it could have happened? Because you just have here, how likely is it that it would have happened?
Oh
Well,
yeah,
I'll go
yeah.
ahead
No,
if you
go
want me
ahead, go
to.
ahead, Doctor Habermas. Yeah.
I keep citing guys like Vermesh, Lapid, Ludeman, uh, Ehrman because they're non-Christians, and I do that so that people don't say, "You prejudiced fundamentalist, you only cite all your preacher buddies and what you say in a church, and you don't have any data." So I cite them and I say, argue with Ehrman, argue with Ludeman. They take your view in general naturalism, but they don't agree with your specifics here. Um, so I love it when a Bart Ehrman says, I am going to cite New Testament scriptures. Why? Because I think they're inspired? Ha, no way. I'm not a Christian. Why? Because the Gospels are reliable? No way. I don't think the Gospels are reliable. Then why do you keep citing these verses over and over? Bart Ehrman's asking this question. People want to know why he's citing verses. Ehrman says, I'm a specialist. I know which verses are probable and are weighted by good evidence. They're the ones I cite. I've checked this out with biologists. I'm not sure it's a great illustration, but it's something like this. Why can a spider run across its net and never get caught? Presumably, the spider knows which strands it can run on and which ones it can't, or somehow immune, but it knows the difference. Ehrman says, I don't quote these things because they're good texts as a whole. I cite them because these individual passages like Galatians 1 and 2 and the creeds are well attested. That's the view I'm taking too. I often, when I'm at a university campus, I'll often hold up a little New Testament I bring and I'll say, hey, you guys tell me. And I'm sometimes co-sponsored by both an atheist group on campus and an evangelical group on campus. And they'll both come up and introduce their groups before we start. And I'll hold up a New Testament. I'll say, hey, all of you, tell me about what you think. If the Bible is inspired, was Jesus raised from the dead? And all together, everybody in the room goes, well, yeah, if it's inspired. Okay, good. That's fine. If it's reliable, is Jesus raised from the dead? And they'll go, well, it depends on what part's reliable. And that's entirely true. That's a good response. What's reliable? But I'll ask, what if it's unreliable? What if our Bible is Bart Ehrman's Bible? Gulp. You still get a resurrection. My argument is, yes, you still get a resurrection because my Bible, the Bible that Ehrman and Vermesh and Lapid and Ludeman and many others accept is the argument from which the minimal facts are drawn. That's another way to say that's what the minimal facts are. So you can believe the Bible is inspired. That's great. You can get some good books on reliability. That's good. But I'm saying if you start at the lowest methodological point, you can still get deity, death, resurrection, what we call the gospel.
Awesome. All right. So, what about this issue of the hostility of the environment that Christianity comes about in? Right, it's birthed in an environment that's not really friendly towards it. Specifically, how does that argue in favor, or does it argue in favor of the resurrection at all? The fact that it comes about in this, this environment that is really it goes against the grain of it, and in some ways, it's being persecuted.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure where you're coming from, but I think if I'm guessing correctly, what I'm thinking is the environment is getting tougher, so we're going to have to major on the major and minor on the minor. The center of Christianity is what we call the gospel. Traditionally, the definition of the gospel includes the facts of the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. You say, what about buried and rose? Well, buried, for example, is only mentioned maybe half the times in the gospel definitions in the New Testament, chiefly, by the way, in Paul's writings and in the early sermon summaries in Acts. But deity, death, resurrection, I think we should major on that and not let people get off the subject, certainly not to political things, but not to happenstance and I hate you guys. And I mean, when people say that to us, we can't let that be a going off point and start, letting the conversation drop down into a kind of, ad hominem. I think we have to keep our cool all the time and stay on the gospel. We generally only have a short time to speak. In an interview like this or on a university campus, we only have a short time to speak. So stay on what's ultimately important. So if someone during a Q&A says, well, what do you do with the genocide passages in the Old Testament? I'll often tease and I'll say, what's your point? Well, there's genocide passages in the Old Testament. I said, well, that's beside the point if they're there, but what's your point? Well, that's not good. Yeah, I get that. So what's your point? Is that the Bible you accept? And they've missed everything I've said. Because I'm saying whatever Bible I accept, yes, I accept Bible as scripture, but whatever Bible I accept, the Bible of the New Testament of the minimal facts, we can talk about the so-called genocide patches later. We've got a PhD student here who has had, I believe it's 45-ish hours at the MA PhD level of Greek and Hebrew. He's doing his thesis on the Old Testament. He's an Old Testament specialist. He's doing his dissertation on the so-called genocide passages. So can we deal with those things? Yes, we certainly can. But let's major on the major. So when you ask me about genocide, I'll say, ask me next week. Have me back. But I've only got a short time here. Well, you just don't want to treat the genocide passages. No, it's that I do want to treat the gospel. Right. Talking about the genocide passages will not determine where you are vis-a-vis God. And if you think the genocide passages are a difficult one, try resurrection with the naturalist. So I am going for the hardest thing I can go for, but it also happens to be the center.
That's a great strategy. I like that. So kind of, Russell, well, all right, we think we got a couple of fun questions here in closing. Russell, you want to ask yours?
Yeah, first, because we're pretty much concluded there with the interview section, all the questions. And I love interviewing you, Dr. Habermas, because you answer a lot of my questions without even me having to ask the questions. So I've had to eliminate some of them, So, but okay. So just for fun, there's this claim that I hear a lot of the skeptics make, right? That, well, I'm not a Jesus mythicist. I'm a mythicist on who Jesus claims that he was. And I think you pretty much answered it by saying, hey, whatever Bible I have, I have a resurrection, or whatever,
Right.
So I think that's a good strategy. And so I was going to go to the Shroud and to see how confident you are, for our audience, to see how confident you were on its authenticity.
Yeah. By the way, you guys have made several comments about preempting your questions. I've not seen your questions ahead of time. Yeah. So that means great minds run in the same line. I guess that's what that means. The Shroud, I make some of my Shroud friends uneasy. I've co-authored 2 books on the Shroud. My co-author, Ken Stevenson, was one of the original team members who did the 1978 investigation in Turin. He was an Air Force professor at the time, Air Force Academy. And, okay, so I'm there with Ken. He's on the bottom floor of the research. And I only tell people that when they say, what do you think about the Shroud? Here's my funny little answer. I'll say, What day is this? Is it warm? No, it's snowing outside. Well, that's cool because I like snow too. Okay, I'm probably pretty positive today because it's a nice day outside. What side of the bed did I get up on? And I'm just teasing people. Um, my view of the shroud, there's some play in the shroud because whenever you throw your hat in the ring of scientific data, you've got to put up with the scientific data. And the scientific data on the shroud fluctuate. However, I think there's a fairly decent chance the shroud is what it claims to be, the burial garment of Jesus Christ. Maybe I could say it this way. Some friends of mine, totally unbeknownst to me, just published a Festschrift in my honor, a book that's a bunch of well-known folks write comments about one of my areas of research, like the shroud or the resurrection or near-death experiences. By the way, Dale Allison contributed a chapter to that book. We've been friends, and Bob Price could have. I mean, I didn't put the list together, but one of the guys who did a chapter is Barry Schwartz. Barry Schwartz has the best-known shroud site in existence. And for the listeners, it's called shroud.com. And if you want to see the best photographs available and hear pro and con views, go to Barry's site. Why am I bringing this up? Barry is a non-Christian Jew from an Orthodox Jewish family. He believes the Shroud of Turin is the actual burial garment of Jesus. He's been saying this for, I have an article that he does an interview and he affirms this way back in 1982. So he's been saying it for at least 40 years. He believes it's Jesus. He does not have a religious axe to grind. He's not a Christian. And he believes it's Jesus' burial garment. Now, when I say to him, we've talked for hours and hours, and when I say, Barry, is the image on the shroud the resurrection? He might just quip. He might just say something funny like, well, golly, I hope not, or something like that. And I'll say, well, what do you do with all the data that the image is radiation? He'll say, well, I think there's some other theories that at least make some sense. But, I'm hoping for a good naturalistic theory on the resurrection part, but not on the part of it being Jesus' burial garment. So I think there's a fair amount of probability there, but my views go up and down. Sorry to do that so much, but I just want to say it in context so I don't get quoted out of context later.
That's going to happen probably anyway. That's what everybody tries to do with
That's right.
It's insane how much of that actually goes on. But I do have a question from a fan, and feel free to just say no comment. But they asked me to ask, where are you at on the magnum opus?
It's mostly done. Here's a bunch of little short comments. It's mostly done. It's very, very long. It makes me weary. I start on my computer in the morning. In the last week, I have probably gotten off my computer more so than not after 12 o'clock a.m. So I'm on my computer a lot. I have thousands of pages still to edit. I can't really put it out there till it's edited. And I haven't even found a publisher. I haven't really started looking. I've had some publisher come to me and say, can we do it? But that's not because I've had any involved conversations or been looking. Long way to go, can be very slow, but data-wise, people are going to be surprised. 150 pages, I think, on the historicity of Jesus, 150 pages, refutations of David Hume's essay on miracles and where we are right now, almost 100 pages of historical data for the death of Jesus, the physical death of Jesus, over 100 pages on mythological theories, and are there pre-Christian death and resurrection of Messiah stories in pre-Christian texts. And I do each of the minimal facts a chapter each, and they very frequently have more than 100 footnotes, sometimes 200, just for those individual events. So it's very, very long, and I have a very long way to go. I just hope the Lord leaves me here long enough to
Well,
to
if he
finish
does,
it.
I'd like a signed copy, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, I had a guy write to me. I don't even know him. He wrote to me, he said, warn me when that thing's coming out. I want to get a second mortgage on my house.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Well, Dr. Habermas, we again, your ministry and your teachings have greatly blessed my life, and I'm sure David Pallmann can attest to that too. And we loved having you on here. We really thank you for making the time for us during this hectic season and writing a magnum opus. So,
Oh, we got to ask him one more
okay,
question,
okay.
last question. Because we know that Russell he's a big
No, no.
presuppositionalist, and so obviously that a magnum opus that you're writing, that's a lot of evidence. So I feel like that's going to rub him the wrong way. And Nick Peters has told me that you're not exactly a fan of presuppositionalism. So real quick, what are your thoughts on presuppositional apologetics?
Well, I'll tell you what, instead of giving you my view, let me tell you a quick little story that may just blow your guys' mind. Years ago, I got to be good friends with Greg Bonson. Greg at that time probably still has a reputation of being the most learned presuppositionalist, classical presuppositionalist in the last generation. I mean, you can take Van Til, but Greg is a great interpreter of Van Til's before he passed away. And he heard me give my minimal facts argument for the first time. And we had dinner that night. And I said, "What do you think, Greg? Are you totally against this because you don't like evidence?" And he said, "You misunderstand me. I have no problem with the evidence. I love evidence. In fact," he said, "I think your argument is a presuppositionalist argument." And I almost choked. And I said, "Come again?" He goes, "No, no, no. Hear me out." He said, "Presuppositionalists are famous for taking their critics' arguments and turning them back against them." He said, "You're taking the New Testament critics and establishing points that on their testimony, on our testimony, it comes short of the word of God. But in their testimony, there's still a resurrection. Conclusion, there's still a resurrection." He said, "I love your argument." I said, "Well, Greg, I don't consider it a presuppositional argument for a number of reasons, but thank you for saying so." So anyway, Greg Bonson had no problem with that. One time he was in my home some years later, and he told me he had no problem using resurrection evidence with unbelievers while he was witnessing. That's a second strong comment from Greg Bonson.
All right.
He just went up in
He
my
just
book.
went up.
There you go.
Oh yeah, David has a problem with pre-suppers. We had an open mic night here not too long ago, a couple days ago now, and we had a presuppositionalist come on our open mic and just
Yeah, he called in.
barged us there with his long-winded speeches there and his methods. So I had to kind of cut him short.
Yeah. Well, all anybody has to do is read the 5U books from Zondervan, and they'll see what I think about presuppositional arguments. I kind of go off on them too. But I'm just saying that if we're going to stick to the heart of the message with the deity, death, and resurrection, Van Til, Frame, Bonson, Montgomery, Geisler, Craig, Moreland, the whole crew, we agree on that central message and the good evidences for it. I don't know anybody in that group that would disagree with that.
Oh, awesome.
Awesome.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Habermas, for taking the time out for us. And is there anything you want to add, a plug-in for any websites, anything like that?
The only thing I would say is anybody who wants to track some of this stuff way more than we can do today, I'll give them two sources. One is my website, GaryHabermas.com. And the other one is we just recently put up a YouTube channel. It's just getting started. It's only been up and running it's been up for a few months, but I mean, a very few months, but up and running with things actually being put on it, probably for 2 months max. And it's just getting going. But people can go there and, see it in action. There's a lot of action. There's also debates, other things, audio and video and book publications. 2 of my 3 books on doubt are on my website, free of charge. Nothing's for sale on my website. So those 2, my YouTube site, look up my name, and then GaryHabermas.com for the website. Appreciate you asking that.
Yep. And again, thank you so much, David. Do you have anything to add? We have another interview coming up today, actually. We have another interview coming up today with Jay Warner. This month is guest host month. As you guys know, we are here for you. We're not here for ourselves. We're here for you. And this is your month to help us host debates and discussions. So whatever you want, you just send me a PM and we will make an arrangement. So with that, David, I am going to close the show. Everybody have a good day. Thanks again, Dr. Habermas, for coming on.
Enjoyed it, fellows. Enjoyed it very much.